This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
Thank you, Chair. I want to start by asking our finance officials about Canadian investments in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Our party has long opposed Canadian entry into the AIIB. At the time of initially expressing this opposition, we were aligned with the then Obama administration, which saw this bank as Chinese state controlled and as a tool of China's state foreign policy. And we didn't see any point in having Canadian taxpayers fund that. According to the latest edition of the public accounts, Canada has shares worth about $1 billion in the AIIB, some of which are paid in, although most of which are not paid in and are callable. The government has just recently announced suspending activity with the bank in response to some of these criticisms that have in fact been long-standing, but have since been repeated by someone who used to work for the bank. But in the midst of suspending activities with the bank, large portions of Canadian capital are already in the bank. So I wonder if you could clarify what it actually means to say that Canada has suspended activities with the bank, given that a substantial amount of taxpayers' dollars are already in the bank and presumably continue to be available to the bank for its use.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for the question. I'm afraid that I'm not able to answer questions with respect to the Asian Infrastructure Bank, as my area of expertise is federally regulated pensions policy.
Thank you. Is Mr. Wu able to answer those questions?
Hi, Mr. Chair. So similarly, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is not part of our purview for discussion today. I would flag, and I note that, of course, the Deputy Prime Minister did provide a press release June 14th stating that the Department of Finance is conducting a review at this time, so we're in the process of gathering.
Yeah, I mean, I can read the press release. Are you able to give me information beyond what's in the press release or not?
Not at this time.
Your minister is the governor of the bank, and I would welcome a response to the committee in writing from the department if one is available. The last time I raised this issue was with Michael Sabia, who was at the time the deputy minister, and he strongly denied my assertions that the bank was Chinese state controlled, and I think it'd be useful to find out where the government stands now, what it means by suspending that activity, and also I'd like to know what the timeline is for this review. Is this just kind of a say we're reviewing it to get it out of the news issue, or is there an actual serious review where we're going to hear back a decision and a series of actions in response? Because these criticisms are not new; they've been long-standing. But I'll move on to some other items. To Mr. Hutchinson, in terms of your testimony, you talked about how if there are violations of Canadian law, that you will withdraw services from companies. Does it go any further than that, though? Or is there public information released that certain companies were found to be violating the law or involved in serious violations of human rights? Do you refer the matter to law enforcement? Are there any next steps, or do you just quietly say you can't have any help from us anymore and then move on?
Mr. Chair, the TCS takes allegations of misconduct by clients seriously. In the event of a clear violation of Canadian law or international law, we could refer it to law enforcement. The other thing that we do is if we withdraw services, we will advise other members of our portfolio, such as EDC and CCC. But we also maintain commercial confidentiality, so we don't name the companies that we no longer provide service to.
So if you're breaking the law and receiving government services in the process, then you have the comfort of knowing that your privacy will be protected nonetheless. How many instances have there been in which you have referred these matters to law enforcement in the last, let's say, 12 months?
Mr. Chair, I don't have a precise answer on that, but I would be happy to endeavor to provide an answer to the committee.
Okay, thank you. If you're coming back to the committee with that information, I would like you to be able to provide, let's say, in each of the last 5 years, how many companies have had services withdrawn, and in how many of those instances you have provided a referral to law enforcement. Would you be able to provide that information to the committee broken down by year?
Mr. Chair, we will look into, in terms of, following our procedures, what we can release to the committee. We'll be very happy to share it.
Yeah, just to reiterate, I am, although I think there should be some public information around the names, I am, in this instance, not asking for that. I'm just asking for numbers of companies per year and what proportion of those were referred to law enforcement. I don't see any reason why you wouldn't be able to provide that information, and the committee is asking you for it. So can you assure us that you'll be able to provide that information?
Mr. Chair, we'll endeavor to provide all the information that we can.
Okay, thank you. And finally, just back to our finance officials, you talked about what's in the best interest of investors, and human rights factors could be taken into consideration insofar as that may impact financial performance. If I understand you right, though, human rights factors are only taken into consideration to the extent that they impact financial performance. And if they don't impact financial performance, then they are not. Then investors are not to take that into consideration. Is that correct?
Mr. Genis, your time is up. Perhaps we could get a written response to that, if you could, please. And all written responses, by the way, should be sent to our analysts and through them to the committee members. Again, we'd appreciate something by end of week so that we can obviously work on that draft report. All right, we will now go to Mr. Fragaskatos for 6 minutes or less. And we'll now go to our second round, and we'll begin with Mr. Kimmich for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I want an answer to Mr. Garnett, Genis's question. So human rights only matter when it materially impacts the financial performance. Is that correct, Ms. Rai?
Thank you very much for the question. I would say that issues such as human rights are definitely a consideration that should be taken into account in all investment decisions by pension plan administrators.
So they don't, or they do? Because you were very specific in your language that you said materially affects financial performance. So if it doesn't materially affect financial performance, then it doesn't matter? It's not considered?
Thank you very much for the question, Chair. I wouldn't say that it is not considered. I say things are considered to the extent that they would materially affect the financial interests of the pension plans. Ultimately, the purpose of the pension plan is to provide benefits to all members and retirees.
So basically, if I can earn a great return in Zhejiang province by running a T-shirt factory using cotton from slave labor, what happens then? Thank you
For the question, Mr. Chair. I can't speculate on the investment decisions of pension plan administrators other than to say what I have already mentioned about they have a fiduciary duty to plan members and beneficiaries, and as part of that duty, they're required to take all factors into consideration when making investment decisions.
Yeah, but we all followed the news, and this has been an ongoing issue since before the pandemic. Before the pandemic, legislation has been passed in the United States, and Canada is trying to do it too, to clamp down on what's happening in the Zhejiang province. This parliament passed a motion saying that there is a genocide ongoing of the Uyghur population. So I don't really care what the returns are. Wrong is wrong. So I'm trying to understand what are the rules when it comes to private sector pensions in Canada. If they can earn a return, it sounds like there are no rules, that if it doesn't materially impact the pension plan, it's considered, discounted, and they carry on. Am I correct?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for the question. That is, I'd like to say in some respect, that the whole framework does rest on fiduciary duty, so it is up to each plan administrator to determine what is considered when making investment decisions. And it is expected, as I said, there's a growing acceptance that ESG considerations do have an impact on investment decisions, and plan administrators should be taking them into account.
You've said before that specific companies are not excluded. There's no a restricted entities list, correct?
Thank you for the question. That is correct.
That is correct. Years ago, when the Canada Pension Plan came before the Finance Committee, in their passive investments, they had two companies that they had invested with. Those two companies were credibly found to be organizing and setting up the technology being used in some of these concentration camps where Uyghurs are being led into and persecuted and abused in it. One was the Hangzhou Hikvision, and the other one was the Zhejiang Dahua Tech. At the time, the CPP then followed up with me to inform me that they did divest themselves and that they knew this was a risk to their investments. Have any private sector pensions come to you asking those types of questions about specific companies they should be divesting themselves from because they could be a risk to them?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. No, that is not an area that my team, or say the Department of Finance, gets into. We are primarily focused on the overall framework and pension policy.
So even really bad technology companies that are continuing the persecution by setting up IT, so I mean cameras, they're setting up video technology in these camps, they're allowing for biometric surveillance of Uyghurs who are being released after being abused in these camps. Even though there are specific companies that are in the news, your branch section doesn't, if you're proactively asked by a private sector pension plan, you won't proactively tell them you should probably not invest in it because it could impact your bottom line?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for the question. That's not the type of question that the department would receive with respect to specific investments. I would say that it is possible that pension plan administrators might speak with the Office of Superintendent of Financial Institutions, which is responsible for supervising and regulating private sector plans. So I can't really speculate on what type of questions OSFI may receive, but that's not the type of question that would be asked of the department.
Does your section send out any notices then? Like, how do you inform private sector pension plans then about their responsibilities or about potential risks about investing in the People's Republic of China and specifically the Zhejiang province? Would you send out like a notice to administrators in Canada that these are the things you should pay attention to just as a forewarning?
Thank you for the question. That's not something that my department would do. However, as I mentioned in my opening statement, there's the Canadian Association of Pension Supervisory Authorities, which is the body of national regulators. So it's represented by all pension regulators across the country. So for the federal government, it's represented by OSFI. And guidance on these kinds of areas is the thing that this group does, as well as OSFI does issue guidance. So they are working on draft guidelines at the moment with respect to ESG considerations in investment, which was out last year for consultation. I believe it's going out again for a second round. So that's the area where pension plan administrators could look to seek guidance on things that they should be considering as part of their investment role.
You've said could look, but this has
Excuse
been...
me, Mr. Kimmich, you are out of time.
That's okay.
So I think clearly there's a lot of interest here in ensuring that pension funds are not investing in companies in the People's Republic of China that are either partnered with the People's Liberation Army or engaged in gross human rights violations. So, the U.S., two U.S. administrations now have issued executive orders banning U.S. investments in a number of companies in the PRCs under one of two rubrics, either gross human rights violations, such as the case of Hikvision, or Huawei, which is engaged very intimately in the propagation of a genocide against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, or companies that are closely aligned with the PLA, which is obviously threatening a lot of the countries in the Indo-Pacific region. So my question to you is, about 10% of pensions in Canada are federally regulated. With respect to those federally regulated pensions, if the government of Canada wanted to ban pension investments because of human rights violations or because of proximity to the PLA, what is the right instrument for the government of Canada to implement a ban on certain federally regulated pension investments in certain companies in the PRC? Does statute currently provide for those powers through regulation? Or does new legislation need to be introduced? What instrument, if any, is available to do that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. I'm not really in a position to be able to speculate on future changes.
I'm not asking you to speculate. I'm asking you to ask what instruments are available if a government wanted to ban, let's say, Royal Bank, which has a defined pension benefit plan, from making investments in certain companies in the PRC. What instrument is available to the government of Canada?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. Again, It's not a question I can really speak to as to what legislative or regulatory vehicle the government may or may decide not to use.
Okay, well, are you familiar with the federal statute, called the the Pension Benefits Standards Act?
Yes.
Okay, so are there powers granted to the Government Council to ban federally regulated pensions from making investments outside of Canada?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. In order to be clear, I'd like to get back to the committee in writing on that question.
That would be helpful. Okay. In respect of the Canada Pension Plan, which, as you know, is a joint federal-provincial arrangement, what instrument could be used there to prevent the CPPIB from making investments into companies either directly, or indirectly through indices in the PRC? What would be the instrument or the mechanism by which to do that? Would there have to be a reopening of the Fed-Prov agreement on this, or are there instruments available to the government to use presently?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. Unfortunately, the Canada Pension Plan is outside my area of expertise.
Okay, so it's a finance question.
Perhaps I would see if my colleague, Mr. Wu, had anything to add.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair, for the question. So the Canada Pension Plan investments are governed by both legislation and regulations. To give you a more precise answer, I would also like the opportunity to take this away and consult with our Department of Justice colleagues as to the answer. That said, in order to make any changes, whether to the legislation or to the regulations, it requires 2/3 of the participating provinces to also agree to any potential changes, and representing not less than 2/3 of the population. I believe this is an area that the CPP investments have spoken to this committee on before in the past. I believe it was Michel Leduc who kindly participated and provided answers on these issues as well.
Thank you, Mr. Wu, for that answer. I'm just going to put a point on the record here, Mr. Chair. I think this ESG stuff is a lot of marketing and not a lot of action. I recall 10 years ago the whole mantra about CSR, corporate social responsibility, that kind of morphed into ESG. And so my view is that if we're going to prevent investments in corporations complicit in human rights violations or corporations that are assisting the People's Liberation Army in promulgating its threats throughout the Indo-Pacific region, that the government has to use mandatory measures under law and regulation to prevent companies from making these kinds of investments. Because the ESG provisions that were inserted into the Pension Benefits Standard Act through the last budget, I don't think are really going to amount to much if it's just a continuation of the ESG that I've been reading about for the last several years from the corporate community. I think it's a lot of marketing and not a lot of action.
One might suspect that some recommendations may emerge out of your perspective.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.